The model, the 3D model, it's a kind of a skeleton that holds different types of evidentiary and archival material and kind of establishes the relationship between them. In this case, the model becomes a skeleton that holds the aerial survey of 1945. It holds images from the ground. It holds the memories of those who were present in these villages. And it builds the relationship between the memories, the image documentations from the ground, and the image documentations from the air. The more these kind of are these intersections, the more evidentiary the work is. This is precisely the work of the model, to build the intersection between these different kinds of testimonies.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Samaneh Moafi. Samaneh is the Assistant Director of Research at Forensic Architecture, a research agency operating across human rights, journalism, architecture, art, academia, and the law. Their interdisciplinary investigations have been crucial in providing evidence in cases of state violence where ordinary and typical investigative journalism has failed. Perhaps one of their most famous investigations was into the killing of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, and it was Forensic Architecture who proved that she was shot dead by the Israeli Defense Forces while covering a raid at a refugee camp. Samaneh joins me today to discuss their most recent report released on the state of genocide in Palestine at the hands of Israel. Named A Cartography of Genocide, they have shown that Israel has repeatedly reshaped the Gazan territory, attacked citizens in safe zones, destroyed food and water systems, targeted medical infrastructure, attacked civilian infrastructure, and targeted aid. They have come to the conclusion that the violence in Gaza is a systemic and organized campaign to destroy life. This report is the result of over a year's work. It is available on their platform for the public and for other researchers. It was also compiled as a special report for the South African lawyers who were working on the ICC case against Israel. And it shatters the narrative of the mainstream media in the West and of Israel and its allies everywhere that what is happening in Gaza is a justified reaction to October 7th. This report calls that violence by its name, genocide. And in the episode, Samaneh walks us through some of the findings from the report, the work that Forensic Architecture have also done, reconstructing the Nakba in certain villages, how their methodology reconstructs shared memories and lived experience to document atrocities and buttress technical evidence. And finally, she explains how this report is being used by legal forums, media forums, and cultural forums to bring change in the hope that one day Palestine will be free. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Samaneh, welcome to Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
Okay, Rachel. We're talking now 14 months into a genocide in Gaza, a genocide that we haven't yet been able to stop, that has been unfolding live in front of our eyes, and we haven't been able to stop it. How about bringing accountability to it? And it's something that forensic architecture is known as a kind of an archaeologist of a recent past, of incidents, events that take place in the kind of like in the immediate past. But also, sometimes we go back for years. I mean, in the case of Palestine, we've investigated Nakba through and the kind of like the violence that took place across many of the villages in Tantura, in the Wayme, in Al Ma'in more recently is a kind of like is a sites that we're reconstructing. And you know, irrespective of the time, whether it was within the past year or if it's kind of like if it's from years back, and Nakba, these incidents, these acts of violence are shaping our present. They're shaping the kind of like the everyday life of our present, and they will shape our future if we don't stop them. This is what I define as crisis.
Thank you. I would, if possible, Samaneh, I don't know, and that's a mistake on my part. I don't know how much of your investigation into the Nakba is public yet, but could we go there and discuss some of that first as we lead towards your most recent report?
Yes, definitely. It's actually so a few years ago, we began looking at Nakba, reconstructing what actually took place. There are only very few survivors from Nakba. Many of it's kind of like, you know, they're and those survivors would have been children at the time when the destruction of life happened in Palestine. And it was a project that we started with the village of Tantura, and this is one investigation that we have actually published now. It's accessible through our website. We were working with survivors of the massacre in Tantura. We were using a technique that we call situated testimony. What it involves is we reconstruct the site, the village, in this case, with as much detail as we can, using aerial imagery, archival aerial imagery, images from the ground. Many of the villages in Palestine were photographed before. And also there is kind of like this, I'm not sure if you know about this aerial imagery. So it's in the kind of like the months of January and in 1945, where a British, it's kind of like a British aerial survey is conducted over Palestine. And this aerial survey has such a high resolution that you can identify wells in it, tents, building structures, kind of like it has such a high resolution. And we've used it in many of our investigations as a way of kind of like showing the presence of Palestinians. We did this, I think, first in our investigation of displacement in the Nakba desert. The Bedouin Palestinians who were kind of repeatedly displaced in the Nakba. But let me kind of like come back to the case of Tantura. So we were using aerial imagery and images taken at the time from the ground to reconstruct the village. So we had a kind of a base. And then we took this model, this 3D model, to the survivors. And we sat with them and we asked them to kind of tell us and remember with the model what the village was like and what began to happen on the day of their displacement, on the day of the massacre. And in this kind of like a case, the model is a kind of a tool for returning to what is often the most traumatic kind of event of one's lifetime in a safe way, in a kind of like, you know, in a way, in at the time that they would be returning to it from the position of control. They have full control over what they're seeing, how they're navigating in space. We think of ourselves as those who are providing a modeling aid and a navigation aid, and we make sure that they have the kind of like the authority and the power to move across space, to go from an allocentric point of view to an egocentric point of view, and really kind of like assess the events themselves on the spot at the time. And we use this process of reconstruction and an event, as a way of, like reconstructing something that only exists in memory. There is kind of like no hard evidence, in a kind of like a classic sense for it. And so by reconstructing it, we make it something that is shareable, that can be understood by the next generations. And we do this with kind of like not one person, but like many survivors of the same model, of the same space. And kind of like that becomes, therefore kind of gradually the model holds this shared memory, this collective memory of the event. We've done this work on the village of Tentur. We will publish the work we've done on the village of the Wayme. And in the coming months or so, in the coming next few months, we hope to be able to publish the work that we've been doing with Salman Abu Sitta on the village of Al Ma'in. It's a village that Salman is a historian and archivist and survivor of Nakba, and his village was Al Ma'in, so it kind of like there's a particular kind of aspect of his archive that is dedicated to the site, and we're working with him to reconstruct the village, its surrounding fields, what took place on the night, on the day, so on.
The work that you're doing poses such an interesting question as to what is considered archival, what is considered evidence, what is considered to be in public thought, or really pushing the boundaries of public thought, really creating a sort of multi-polarity. And instinctively, I know this isn't the direction I should be going down with the next question, but I just, as a journalist, I'm just kind of so fascinated by the idea of, if you reconstruct the past, if you create almost like a living shared memory of something whose documentation has been definitely not ignored by Palestinians or even by fellow Arab countries and Arab populations, but something that has definitely been swept under the rug and denied or obfuscated or misrepresented in colonial thought, which is still kind of the predominant hegemony around the world. What does that do to our understanding of the past? And is it possible to then present that model and that new shared memory to court or to the media, or can it become evidence of something that has actually happened? Or are there still hurdles in place to actually considering what you as archaeologists of very recent history have unearthed with the gravity that it needs to be considered?
I'm glad that you asked this. I want to kind of first say something with regards to Nakba. Of course, Nakba has been remembered in very kind of creative and powerful ways by Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And I think all that we are trying to do in this case is to do our bit, is to offer the tools that we have to do the same in the kind of like in a different way, right? The model, the 3D model, has the capacity to be evidentiary. The way that we use it, it's a kind of a skeleton that holds different types of evidentiary and archival material and kind of establishes the relationship between them. In this case, the model becomes a kind of a skeleton that holds the aerial survey of 1945. It holds images from the ground. It holds the memories of those who were present in these villages. and it builds the relationship between the memories, the image documentations from the ground, and the image documentations from the air. These intersections, the more these kind of like are these intersections, the more evidentiary the work is. This is kind of like precisely the work of the model, to build the intersection between these different kinds of testimonies. And for this, we have been able to present the model as in its work of doing so. I think kind of like we've done this in many of our cases. Relevant to London, of course, is our work on the fire at the Grenfell Tower, where we worked with many of the survivors and the bereaved who had memories of the tower as a way of kind of like reconstructing what actually took place, and reconstruct what actually took place in a shared way, in a way that it's a shared account of the events of that night.
I think this is what is so particularly fascinating about the work done at Forensic Architecture is, I mean, the line between journalism, investigation, art, archiving, it's all blurred. It goes beyond interdisciplinary thought and really becomes interdisciplinary thought with regards to what is also stored in the body and thoughts that can be shared across bodies. And it begins to allow for not just a three-dimensional, and I know physicists are going to be like, you're incorrectly using that term, but like four-dimensional, five-dimensional experience and lived history, and bringing lived history into the past and making what was then to also be now. And I personally don't know of any others in Europe doing exactly the work that you guys are doing, but it is such a fascinating amalgamation of what is made possible with technology and also what is made possible with care and with a recognition of narrative and story building and bias. And when you all announced that you were obviously looking into what is currently going on in Palestine, the genocide that's been ongoing for 14 months, I think a number of people who are aware of your work really breathed a sigh of relief, because the stories that are coming out directly from the ground from Palestinian people are not reflected at all in the stories that are being told by those who own the means of communication and the people who have power as well within politics or industry or whatever. And so to be able to really build something that we can all sit with and sit within, and that can also invite them into us, if you will, through that model, I think is just really critical at this time when their lived experience of genocide is still being denied across the vast majority of countries all around the world. And I think that takes us very nicely into a Cartography of Genocide, which is the latest report that you have released on this. This report is published in a background of, as I said, denial. What was it? What were the beginning steps to begin to construct the methodology and then the models which led you to the devastating conclusions, which I will, of course, allow you to explain to the listeners?
I'm so glad that you kind of like you raised this. See, Forensic Architecture, our team, it's a group of researchers who are coming from very, very different backgrounds. Professionally, sure, some of them are architects, some of us are journalists, come from legal backgrounds, sound analysts, science, programming, kind of like so on and so forth, right? And so that technicality, it's very much, you can see this, that intersection of technical skills, it's something that you see in the fabric of many of the investigations. But also, members of our team come from sites of struggle. They have lived experience of frontiers of struggle. Members of our team are kind of like, and in relation to Palestine, my colleague Noor Abu Zaid is from Gaza. Her family are from there, right? Other members of our team are also kind of Palestinians. Our director is kind of like has was born in Palestine and is Israeli and British, and it's kind of like that's his background. And so see, this lived experience is also part of what makes the team. But also, we never do our work on our own. We always work with communities on the ground, fence-line communities. In the case of Gaza, it's not a place we've been foreign to, right? I think the very first investigation in forensic architecture that I worked on was the 2014 bombing of Rafah. At the time, we were working with researchers on the ground. Since then, we have now partners who are based in Gaza. I'm thinking of in Media Gaza, who are a group of journalists and photographers who were also affected heavily over the past year. 3 of their reporters were on the Erez crossing on October 7th to document what was taking place, and one of them was killed, 2 of them were disappeared. The founder of Ain Media, Rushdie, he was killed by a drone strike at the during the first few weeks of the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. And yet still they're ongoing, they haven't stopped yet, and they're still doing this work of photographing the ground, documenting the ground. And this is an example, right? So I want to say that it's it's a place where we're committed to in many ways, right? And when from early October, we knew that we have to respond. I mean, sometimes it's not a choice, right? You know that this is something that you have to respond to. And it was hard for us to organize at the beginning, to figure out what's the best way forward. The reports that you're referring to, it's a report from a year of research. So immediately after October 7th, we began documenting, analyzing incidents and patterns that were taking place, incidents of violence and patterns of violence that were taking place in Gaza. I can share some of the examples. We did a body of work, for example, on the attack on the Al Ahli hospital. And from the beginning, the work that we did was maybe understanding the crater that was on the ground and trying to analyze it. Then we got into understanding the claims that the Israeli military was making and debunking them, and showcase what is wrong with these claims and how their misinformation. And then more recently, we had the opportunity of working with Gazan Abu Sita, a medic, a doctor who was present in the Al Ahli hospital, and we used the this technique of situated testimony to return to the Al Ahli hospital and reconstruct what took place on the night, and use his expertise as a doctor, as a doctor who sees the flesh and understands what weapon is being used, right? As in, he would read the the wound in a very different way. In a way that we would maybe read the space, and the two together we could reconstruct things in reconstruct his memory and make it accessible also. And these kinds of things of looking at incidents, with the case of Hind Rajab, and so on and so forth. But these were the in-depth analysis of incidents. We began working in a a different way as well, something that we call pattern analysis. So we began identifying the kind of like documenting, plotting in incidents in time and in space as a way of thinking through the patterns that might be behind them, the logic that may be behind them. Our analysis showed that these incidents are not occurring in a haphazard way, but there is an underlying logic in the way that they take place. A logic that is sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit. And this is kind of like, this speaks to intentionality, right? Let me go to kind of like take you to a way that we began working on the destruction of agriculture. And you can see how, and kind of like tell you about how these patterns kind of like unfold from this. Very kind of like in the first few months, I think this was in December or January, that the Abu Sofia family sent us a message. They were very concerned about their orchard. We knew them from an investigation that we had done in 2018 on, at the time, the Israel, there was this kind of practice of herbicidal spraying that Israel was conducting on the eastern perimeter of Gaza, killing the Palestinian herbs. And so we had begun working with the Abu Sofia family back then. The story was that they were displaced from Jabalia all the way south. They had not access to their orchard anymore. And families who were displaced afterwards were telling them that your orchard has been completely erased. And if you were to go back, you would not be able to even understand its perimeter. And they were quite concerned. They did not have the means to go back. That would have been a death sentence. There were no people on the ground to photograph it. And so they asked us. And the only means that came to, like, the only thing that we could think through was looking at satellite imagery. We looked at what was available to us, and we could see that a kind of like a way through which, after the ground invasion, their farm was destroyed. We could see kind of like elements of the presence of D9 bulldozers that were raising the ground back and forth in a kind of like in a way that nothing would stay, you know, like in a back and forth way. We could see practices of construction by the Israeli military, construction of a new road, and construction of earth berms to kind of create encampments for the military so that they could advance in kind of like in stages. And so we began identifying these practices on the ground. Zooming out, we could see that a kind of like a pattern to this destruction, that it was not only the Abu Sofia's orchard that was destroyed, but in fact there was a kind of like there was a logic of destroying the agricultural fields and orchards in Gaza. The majority of them, of course, were along the eastern perimeter. This is the most fertile soil in Gaza. The kind of like along the coast, you have the sand, right? And so it's on this side that you have the loss, which is good for agricultural production, and at the same time we began looking at greenhouses, and we could see the similar kind of like pattern of destruction taking place on the greenhouses. So greenhouses and agricultural farms and orchards, these are the food. This is kind of like the production of food in Gaza relies on these two anchors. We could see that in time between October and the middle of summer, about 70% of all agricultural fields were destroyed. This is kind of like a number that is unprecedented. We haven't come across something like this in the past, the scale of destruction. But this is not just a number, right? So the way in which, the pattern in which this destruction took place, month by month, the way that some places were destroyed again and again, and kind of like the way that over months, the way that these destructions correlated with the Israeli ground invasion, this is kind of like what we call the interlocking of patterns, the way kind of like one pattern, the pattern of Israeli ground invasion, correlated with patterns of the destruction of agricultural fields and orchards. And then this comes kind of like, consider this and then see this in relation to another pattern, the pattern of a kind of like a spatial pattern that began emerging, the making of a buffer zone about 1 kilometer deep into the perimeter of Gaza. Right? The making of corridors, the Netzarim corridor and the widening of the Philadelphia corridor as a way of kind of like, again, clearing the land. When I'm talking about like a corridor, it's a corridor that there is no structure within, right? It's kind of like it's cleared. And also the beginning of new routes that all connected, that kind of like all started from that connected Israeli military bases on the kind of Israeli side of the perimeter into deep within Gaza, right? So these were routes, sometimes they were built anew, sometimes they were kind of like appropriation of routes that existed. And there was a pattern to them. We called them raid routes because they were, in a way, they were designed for the military to be able to enter, do a kind of like an operation and then leave, right? And there was a kind of like an architecture to them, the way that you had earth berms and encampments designed alongside them within particular intervals, and the kind of like the pattern in which these were used. We could see a kind of like that these routes were the sites through which we had kind of like repeated ground invasion happening across time, right? So I'm talking about a kind of like a pattern in the destruction of environment, that is the fields and the orchards, a pattern in construction of new spaces, new kind of spatial features, and then a different pattern, the pattern of incidents of attack on aid. So I'm thinking of a kind of like a particular incident that we refer in the report, an incident that occurs on one of these raid routes, and within the buffer zone, it's a kind of like a package of aid that is dropped from air, and this package is dropped within the buffer zone. And so a group of Palestinians decide to run for it and take this in. They arrive at this package. At that very point, there is kind of shooting from the Israeli military on the other side of the border. We can see one of these Palestinians taking a bit of aid and carrying it with him, running away from the border, right? Running on one of these raid routes, but kind of like away from the border towards the kind of like deeper areas in Gaza. And as he's running away, he's been shot repeatedly and killed, right? So these, the kind of like this relation between the attack on aid, the destruction of agriculture and kind of like sources of food, this is a kind of like this has an accumulative effect. This accumulative effect is what we can call an engineered famine, right? So this is the kind of like, this is the work of the report, identifying these patterns, identifying the correlations between them, and explaining what is this accumulative effect that is the result of that comes out of it.
You said in your report that There's been a near total destruction of civilian life in Gaza, and that you have come to the conclusion that this was a systemic and organized campaign to destroy life in the Gaza Strip. This is obviously totally antithetical to what Israel has claimed to be doing, what Israel's supporters have claimed that it is doing, contrary to the live streaming impact that we are seeing coming out from brave Gazans, both journalists and civilian journalists, who are still daring to warn the world of what is happening. And it took, mainstream media probably 6 months to come around to the fact that maybe what Israel was saying was not the truth. In particular, I remember the bombing of the hospital that you referenced, and how, despite it being very obvious that it was yet another hospital targeted in that week, all over the news in the UK at that time, it was I remember when the news became that, maybe it was actually Hamas that did it, even though it was very obvious that it hadn't been at that point. And then amongst all of this comes your report, quite clearly showing that what Israel says it's doing, it is not in fact engaging with, and perhaps more in line with what they have been quite brazen about on Israeli television and even on Twitter, that there is genocidal intent here, calling Palestinians rats, other non-human derogatory terms, saying that the space needs to be cleared. What can the effect of this report be? Are you trying to get it in front of politicians' eyes? Has there been any uptake from the media? Now that we have this information and we have this analysis that's taken a year to collate and can be quite easily corroborated with Palestinian reports of the lived experience of genocide on the ground, what happens next?
Let me first say that this is the platform specifically. So we've designed a platform that also makes this research available. And this platform is something that is interactive. It's for all researchers to be able to use to examine the correlations firsthand, to look and study them. And this is a platform that we want to keep up to date. So we're organizing updates to it on a monthly basis, so that this research is of course not finished, right? It's something that the work of documentations by us is ongoing. How to bring change? For us, the evidentiary work, the making of the analysis and coming to findings, this is only part of our job. To mobilize that evidence to bring change, this is the other half of our work, if you like. This also speaks to the origin of the term forensis. It's the art of the forum. So to bring it to the forum as a way of making change, this is part of our practice. I was mentioning that this is a research that we began from day one. It was at the request of the lawyers representing South Africa at the ICJ that we decided to produce a report about 800 pages long, so that they could reference it in the way that they need to. You see, for a document to for the courts to be able to use an evidence, it needs to have a particular format so that you can reference paragraph A, B, in that a way. And so that format of a report was something that was necessary in order to support claims within this kind of a court. Since then, the report has been referenced quite widely. Francesca Albanese has been referring to it quite a lot at the UN also, and many legal groups who are organizing to stop arms sale from their country to Israel, they have also been finding it quite useful in the kinds of claims that they hope to make. But in order to bring change, I think you cannot simply rely on legal forums. To bring change, you need to actually work across different kinds of forums. You need to work kind of like with the public. You need to work with the collective memories of people. I'm thinking of media forums, which can allow for bringing awareness to a very wide group of people dispersed in time, in space, kind of like across the globe. But that also comes with its own caveats, right? Like a media, for example, your show would have a duration of, say, 1 hour. Some of the kind of media reports have a span of maybe 5 minutes, something like that. So that kind of like, that is really the time space in which you can operate in order to bring that awareness. That limits what you can say, but what that means is that you can kind of reach you can have like a very wide reach. Then we have the cultural forums, the museums, and galleries, and these are forums that can bring, again, another kind of an awareness, a deeper awareness perhaps. Yes, it's a kind of like, it's a much smaller audience that will be able to engage with the work, but they would be able to engage with it with much more time, right? Like a few hours of time, let's say, or like over a few days even, right? If they kind of like wish to go back and back. And so we often find with our investigations that we have to move across these forums, and often the work will take a different shape in order to operate here and in order to operate there, and so on and so forth. So like this is definitely a work that we're committed to do.
Wonderful. Samaneh, I know I have to let you go, so I want to thank you so much for your time, and to the entire team at Forensic Architecture for the work that you're doing. I have one final question for you. Who would you like to platform?
Al-Hab. It's a research group based in, an NGO based in Palestine. They are our long-term collaborators. They've been working on the ground for the same kind of a work that we do of documenting violations. They have been called the terrorist group by the Israeli state. We have so much admiration for them, and I kind of encourage you to invite them on your podcast. They also have a forensic architecture unit inside of their team.
Excellent. I'll be sure to reach out to them. Samaneh, thank you so much for your time today. It was a real pleasure speaking with you. If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.